Hi, I'm Jason Schilling, President of the Alberta Teachers Association. On February 4th, 2002, over 14,000 teachers across Alberta made history when they went on strike, in the largest teacher action in the province's history. The decision to go on strike was not taken lightly and was a culmination of years of teacher frustration, disappointment, and unhappiness in the action or the lack of action by Alberta's provincial government. Their major grievances were class sizes and other student learning conditions, chronic underfunding, and targeted political attacks on public education by elected officials that began in the 1990s and had continued unabated, despite the efforts of teachers and concerned parents to demonstrate how important public education is to the health of the province. It is a striking, and pardon the pun, that not much seems to have changed. I could be talking about the provincial government's approach to public education right now. However, the road to the 2002 strike was a long one, and it took a provincial government fully prepared to go back on its promises, an activist president, and a united, assertive teacher body no longer content with the status quo to make it happen. I'm joined by that very president, Larry Booi, right now to talk about what led to the strike, what he heard from teachers, and any similarities that he sees to what the profession is facing with the current government. Mr. Booi, thanks for joining us.
I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm glad you're taking a long look back at this one.
Well, yeah, I think it's definitely important for us to look at our history as an association when we're dealing with some of the issues that we have right now. So you became president in July 1999. What sort of conditions were teachers facing at that time, and were teachers ready to take job action at that point?
There was a huge frustration on the part of teachers with their kind of classroom conditions. They were simply not able to do their best work with kids, and especially when rising expectations had calls for doing even more for a whole lot of kids whose needs were not being met. That had been the case throughout the 1990s. But the longer it went on, especially in a province that had record surpluses, an abundance of cash, the more the frustrations grew. We went through a period from 1999 to 2000, maybe about a year and a half in there where relations were okay between the government, and they actually looked like they were starting to pay attention. And then there was in 2001 a dramatic shift, and I think it was the government's clear intention expressed in their actions of not making things better and probably tightening the screws that really pushed things over the top. So it was a combination of a background of discontent and frustration with some current kinds of things, particularly in 2001, that basically meant that you didn't have much of an alternative if you cared about trying to get change.
Well, yeah, I agree. And I think one of the factors that seemed to lead to the strike was the outcome of collective bargaining between doctors and nurses and the province in 2001 that saw a substantial increase in funding to the healthcare system. And it seemed that government would do the same with education, especially when Premier Klein made the comments his government had responded to legitimate concerns of doctors and nurses, and then went on to say, and I quote, "The same is true on the education side. Alberta's teachers were part of the solution a few years ago, and we'll make sure that they're fairly compensated and given as good a working environment as possible so that they can know how much they are appreciated." Were you optimistic at that point that things were about to change for the better when you heard Premier Klein make those comments?
First of all, it was Premier Klein, and he was given to kind of off-the-cuff stuff that would have to be reeled back in by the people who were really in power at the time. But it had the effect on teachers of saying, okay, finally they're starting to get it. And by the way, nurses were getting settlements in the neighborhood of 20%. And another important thing with that, they were also getting improvements in conditions of professional practice. So they were getting much better compensated financially, and they were much more able to do their jobs. We made a decision tactically, strategically in the organization to highlight that and to say that this is it's the right thing to happen in healthcare. They needed to make those investments. And it's a very similar situation in education, and they need to make those infusions of cash as well. It very quickly, though, got turned around, not long after Premier Klein made those observations. There was a provincial election in March of 2001. And I think that election played a bit of a role in this. I believe that a lot of this was political. I think that the current minister, Dr. Lyle Oberg, had made a decision to push for the leadership. Premier Klein was not going to be there forever. And the Minister of Health, Gary Marr, was seen by the right wing of the party as giving in to the healthcare and public sector. And I think Dr. Oberg had decided to cast himself as the person who knew how to do public sector bargaining. And so the problem with the situation was when you raise people's expectations, oh, maybe they're finally getting it. And then when the budget comes out and it's going in exactly the opposite direction, it creates a far worse situation than if you hadn't said anything in the first place. Well, I'm referring to the premier on that.
Well, and it looks like that you were in fairly regular contact with the Minister of Education, Dr. Oberg, at the time, which I'll admit I'm a little bit jealous now because I struggle to get any time on the minister's calendar. But the association at that point wasn't even really talking about strikes. So what were your conversations like with the minister at that point? And was he empathetic to the concerns that teachers had?
It depends on when. And I did have regular discussions with the minister. They were not the highlight of my social life, and probably if you were getting meetings with this minister, it wouldn't be of yours either. But up until that election in 2001, that minister actually did some fairly progressive things. He took over a plan for merit pay for teachers, and we were able to convince him to walk away from that and take that $66 million for that plan and invest it in genuine school improvement. And that was this terrific Alberta Initiative for School Improvement. And that was all Lyle Oberg. And I think he was going in a much better direction. We were starting to make some progress on early learning and early intervention. And then all of a sudden, there was this dramatic shift on his part, and he started playing hardball. And I think had he continued on his previous path, I suspect that there wouldn't have been a strike. And I think gradually they would have improved conditions. But I mean, these are choices, and we all bore the consequences of decisions made by all of us at that time.
Well, and I remember early part of my career, I was just teaching, and around this time I just started my teaching career. I remember those early initiatives and just how beneficial they were for students at that time. It was really sad to see that switch and that change. So by the end of January 2002, you went public with the strike plans. And even though you're still having with the meetings with the minister to avoid this, locals began to finalize any kind of job action plans. What were those final days like at that point?
Well, I think it's important to first of all say that once the minister made his decision, we made ours. And in the annual representative assembly of 2001, teacher representatives made a clear decision to go in this direction. And it was quite momentous, actually. We walked away from a previous commitment to local bargaining and trying to use one to support the other. I mean, we had to confront the provincial government. So we went to something called provincially coordinated local collective bargaining. So that by the time we got to early 2002, I think the path was pretty clear. And it was largely a matter of details and who was going out if this strike occurred. There was always the hope that the government would see the light and do for teachers what they had done for nurses and others. But I think Oberg got really locked in. And the longer this thing went on, quite honestly, the more punitive they began. And I should say that there were other people in the government, like the Minister of Labor at the time, Clint Dunford, who was much more amenable to more civilized approaches to problem solving. But Oberg was, I think, a little bit bloody minded. So essentially, by the time we were in January, it was a question of who was going to go and when it was going to happen and how we were going to coordinate it.
Well, I was on our locals strike committee. I was part of the what we call the EPC then, but it would be our teacher welfare committees now. And just remember working on this with our negotiating subcommittees in our locals. And, I was teaching for Palliser just south of, Calgary and the Lethbridge area. And just remember the coordination and the work and the meetings that we had to put these things together and to make plans for our members so that they knew that what was going to happen and what was clear. So the strikes themselves lasted between February 4th till the 21st, when a back to work order was issued. What were you hearing from teachers, parents, and other Albertans during that time specifically?
Actually, Calgary teachers didn't come in until the last 3 days.
Oh,
right?
that's
so
correct.
that things increased as we went along. I thought that the solidarity and the commitment of teachers was just remarkable. And I think part of that was due to about 5 years of preparation. It just wasn't a year and a half of preparation. It was about 5 years of hard work in organizing and mobilizing and working with teachers to get them to that point. With respect to parents, think about it. Here we are about to remove services from little children. And the elementary teachers were among the strongest backers of this move because they were among the most frustrated with their situation. But we had terrific parent support, and that parental support came in part because the cause was just, but also because we didn't talk about our working conditions and how tough it was for us as professionals. We talked about the classroom conditions where we were trying to deliver services to their children, and that this was about high quality education, not about how much we were suffering as people who worked in schools. And so 5 years of work in making that clear to parents got a whole lot of people on our side. Now, by the way, nobody wants a strike. I mean, teachers didn't want to go on strike. Parents didn't want them to go on strike. It's one of those things that you at some point you just have to do. But I was very impressed with how that support held. And in fact, the parental support came out to be even more important when we were ordered back to work and then faced with really punitive legislation.
Well, I agree. And I was living in a small town at that time. And so to be a teacher on strike in a small town as I were at the time, it was sort of like having a spotlight on you. But the parental support at that time and the acknowledgement that we were working towards making education better for our students really resonated with parents. And there was a lot of support. And especially, like you said, when everybody was ordered back to work, parents, if anything, amplified their support for the profession with what they were seeing happen. So,
well, we did some things that actually made a big difference on that too. Our polling indicated that support would go to the side that seemed most fair and reasonable. We did a lot of polling on that, and what we did was fair and reasonable. I'll give you a quick example. We were very vague about when this strike was going to start, and there was a great fear that we would do so before the diploma exams in January, which would have created real hardship. So if you're going to run a strike creating maximum hardship in order to make your point, that would have been the time to do it. We absolutely did not do that. And we made a real point of saying that these strikes are going to start on February 4th, finally, after the diploma exams were over. And I think in the public, there was a big sigh of relief. And that, well, we don't want to see them go on strike, but at least they're being fair and reasonable about it. Like, these were very strategic decisions that we took. And I think a lot of them played to the favor of teachers down the line.
When the back to work order was overturned in the provincial courts, this gave teachers the right to strike again. Why did you insist that they remain in the classroom?
Well, I didn't insist. Provincial Executive Council took that decision. But I can give you our thinking, and it
Yeah.
was virtually unanimous around the table. First of all, we'd made our point, we'd had our strike, and to then say we won the court case, and so we can go back on strike. If there's a deflating element. I remember when we went to the court that day to receive the judgment, we had 4 scenarios in mind. And we knew what we were going to do in every case, but we did not expect this one. It was called Big Win. And so when we phoned back to tell Executive Secretary Charles Hyman that we had won the court case and it was complete and even got costs, he said, oh no, because it creates this dilemma. But we had also determined that the first thing, if that happened, the first thing I would do is get in touch with Premier Klein and say, look, our goal was not to have a strike. Our goal was to get a collective agreement. We were forced into having a strike, but it's time for you as Premier to take control of this. And we need to sit down and work something that will be to the benefit of children and their learning and families and teachers as well. So, and that, by the way, the public really liked that as well, because it was a fair and reasonable move. It's not bloody-minded. Go and try and get an agreement. You've won your case.
How do you think this period of Alberta's history was shaped by its approach to public education?
Are you talking about the government's approach to public education?
Well, it's sort of when you look at, yeah, I guess so. Let's go with that. So,
well, part of the reason that the government didn't put the necessary funds into public education is that they fundamentally didn't believe in it. They were skeptical, but I think there were a lot of people in the party that favored private health and private education. The nurses really stuck it to them in their work. And that party is always a mixture, as all parties. They're a mixture of people. And okay, we'll give in to the healthcare folks, but education, they didn't really believe it was all that important. I think what you've got right now is a far worse government that, in fact, actively wants to undermine public education and create opportunities for private education. There was a bit of that in that time, but there was enough in the Conservative Party that said, let's not be too tough. Let's try to find an agreement. But I think the situation that teachers and the association are in right now is far worse, because these people have, it's obvious, they have a malignant intent. They don't care. And they actually want to undermine what you're doing with kids and create opportunities for private education. That's the big difference that I see.
Well, and that is a huge anxiety for a lot of teachers in the field, is this, what they see as a constant undermining of public education within Alberta, and parents as well. I hear from teachers and parents alike about their concerns. And that actually leads me really nicely into our next question about when you look at the context right now, do you see any similarities to the situation back in 2002 and any sort of major differences?
Sure. They're both situations were bad, but the current situation is deplorable. If teachers were prepared to go on strike, and they had a focus on 3 things, by the way, which we maintain. Number 1, classroom conditions where we can do our best work with all children. Number 2, salary compensation that reflects our important contribution. And number 3, our ability to attract and retain teachers to the profession. And if we would go on strike in 2002 over those circumstances, and then what you look at today with this incredible deterioration, with a constant undermining, huge increases in class sizes, great expectations for needs that can't be met without more support from aides. So it gets worse and worse. And so and then you throw in a pandemic just for the icing on the cake. And I honestly don't know how teachers and others working in education are hanging in there. And my sympathies are with them enormously. The problem is this government is not going to, they're not going to change their minds. If anything, they're tilting to the right. And the current premier is trying to appease people on the right wing. So he's going to get even tougher, right? And I don't think that the NDP did well in the 4 years that they were in power. It was an incredible wasted opportunity where things basically deteriorated. And so if you think that the next election in 2023 might save you, it's only going to happen if you put enormous pressure in the year leading up to that election to make sure that education is the critical piece, along with healthcare, that public services in general have to be registered. And you've got to put enormous pressure on the NDP, or they're going to go back in, if they do get back in, and they're just going to do the same things that they did before, which were just not helpful.
No, I agree. I think that that pressure, it needs to come from not only teachers, but other members of society who value public education as well. And also we need to work with other political parties to make sure that they have platforms and policies around public education that serve our students and respect and recognize the importance that the profession provides to Albertans. So you kind of hit on it a little bit, and you've noted that the challenges that teachers are facing right now are much different, especially when you throw in a pandemic and how that's affected the way that we teach, the government's approach and attitude towards the profession in public education. So if you have a chance right now, what would you say to Alberta teachers right now? Do you have any words of wisdom that you could share with them?
They may not be words of wisdom, but I think they're words of support emerging from years of struggles in the past that I've watched teachers do. And I know this: when teachers stand up and stand together, which is what happened in 2002, and that was the phrase, when that happens, better outcomes occur. And another thing that we talked a lot about at that time was, you don't get what you deserve, and you don't get what you need. You get what you fight for, and you get what you settle for. And I think we've got to fight a whole lot harder in organized, systematic ways. And we talked then about a AAA advocacy, and that is get more angry, get more active, and get more allies. And I really think the key role for the Teachers Association is organization and mobilization and engagement of teachers. I mean, the angst and the suffering, actually, and the discontent is out there. And what I think the association has to do is what it did in the past, and that is find a way to help to organize and engage and mobilize that righteous kind of concern for the classroom and the profession that is out there in teachers. Mm-hmm. And I think it's going to be a tough fight, and there are going to be a lot of bruises, but you will get what you fight for. So get more angry and get more active and get more allies, and your professional association will be leading the charge, and expect your organization to do the mobilization and engagement. And I'm actually optimistic about it down the line. I really am, because fundamentally we know how important public education is and the work that teachers do in the classrooms, and the public is on side with that. But you have to fight harder, and it's going to be a long struggle, and you got to put pressure on everybody. But you'll do it. I know the people over there. It's a great association, and I know teachers. They're wonderful people who just want to make a difference. So now it's a matter of doing the hard work of democracy and making these things happen.
Well, I've always said to people as I've been doing this job, and you know full well what this job is like and the demands of that. But the idea that I believe that we fight for what we value and what we believe in. And I know that I value my students and my colleagues who are working really hard day in and day out. And public education, I'm a product of public education in Alberta, and I believe in it. So I agree with you. We fight for what we value, and encourage members to, always be engaged, advocate, share the information that they have. And so I appreciate your words and your advice there. And I just want to thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your insights. It's been interesting because I remember when I first saw you at a rally at Galt Gardens in Lethbridge and talking about, what we need in education and the importance of teachers and our students and their learning conditions, and just being in awe of the great way that you could talk to a crowd, and having gotten to know you over the course of my career. I appreciate very much the leadership and the insight that you provided for teachers at that time. It was an important part of our association history. There's a lot of lessons there for us to learn, and I believe you've always been the consummate teacher, and you taught lots of students in classrooms, but you also taught a lot of students with the work that you did on Provincial Executive Council and as president. So for that, I thank you very, very much. I thank you for taking time to chat with us today, and I wish you well, and I hope that you stay safe as we work our way through this fifth wave of the pandemic.
Well, and Jason, I'm sending supportive thoughts to you as president, and to Provincial Executive Council, who have to lead the fight in this, and to the whole association and staff, and to those teachers. Those of us who are retired but still in the fight are concerned, but sending really positive thoughts, and are anxious to help in any way. So all the best to all of you.
Our retired teachers are great allies, that's for sure. Appreciate them very much. Thanks again, Larry.
Great.